West was not really to blame. He was hired to bring a boat out to the limit to pick up some people, and they didn't tell him they were aliens, and they didn't tell him that he was breaking law. And of course, when he arrived at Marco, there were the feds waiting for him. So he was sent off to federal prison for a while. Got out, came back down here and became a guide, and nobody paid any attention to him, and nobody worried about it. But this particular day, these were very, very definite people. They knew how to run the world, and they talked about how they did it. And one man said, well, he said, of course, you know, I enjoy coming down here because New York is so full of criminals. It's just full of people that have been in jail, or should be in jail. And I like it down here because you don't have to worry about anything. Nobody down here is a criminal type, and nobody down here has been in any trouble, and you don't have to lock up your wallet. You don't have to do all this. And he said, you know, I can tell by looking at somebody if they've ever been in prison. And I was sitting on the back of the boat laughing. West was sitting up in the front, and he looked at me, and we both had to get up and walk up to the front of the boat and check the engine. They went on and on and on about how they could tell the pallor of prison. There was no question about it. Here was this great, handsome, West was good-looking, great, tough, tan man who had spent 3 years in the clink. But I did my mate's job for them for years, and as I said, they had never had any idea who I was. I didn't tell them, and I had fun. I didn't fish, but I watched them, and watching them was more fun than watching anybody. Because in the old days, the theory was that you fished for tarpon with, you still fish for them. Put a whole mullet on a hook, ran the hook through so when his head was here, the hook came in out of his head, and the prong was up like that. And you threaded it through his body, so and the hook was right on the end of his head. You cast that out as far as you could cast it, and it went to the bottom. And of course, tarpon are bottom feeders, as we all know, and they would come along and pick up the bait. Well, if you had a real bunch of idiots on the boat that you thought were going to get into trouble, you took the line off the reel. After you cast it out, you stripped the line off for about 35 feet, and coil it up very carefully, so when the tarpon picked up the bait and started to run with it, they wouldn't be able to do anything to stop it, so the tarpon would swallow the bait, and then you would go from there. If they knew how to fish, you just took the brake off the reel and told them to hold still, and then let the line run free when the tarpon picked up the bait and started to go with it, and then when you figured he'd gone along far enough, and most of the tarpon will pick up a bait, run about 30 feet, and then stop and swallow it. And after they've stopped and swallowed is when you throw on the brakes and rear back on the rod and bring Mr. Tarpon up out of the water, which to me is still one of the most exciting sights in the world. When you feel that line go out and you slam that brake on and pull back on that rod and that big bird comes flying out of that water with water going everywhere, that's a sight. It's a sight to me today. It still makes my heart stop. But we used to have a terrible time with the ladies with the free line on them because they put their pocketbooks in it. They would, you see, well, they needed their lipsticks and they needed their powder, and they were getting too much sunburn, so they had to get the anti-sunburn lotion and one thing and another, and that entailed getting the pocketbook up, doing the work, putting it back down on the line. So when the line started to run out, they became panic-stricken and put their foot in it in an attempt to get the pocketbook. By that time, the 30 feet were up, and then the tarpon took off. Then the ladies were in real trouble. I mean, it's rather fun to see somebody who is all done up in Hattie Carnegie go to Florida fishing clothes, with their foot tangled up in a tarpon line when they weigh about 190 pounds. It's quite a sight. Quite a sight. And getting them untangled was even more fun. Of course, the fish for this time was long gone. He'd shaken the hook out and gone laughing off to the rest of his friends. But then they had something to talk about, and they talked about that for the rest of the day, and how they almost caught a tarpon. But we had great, great fun, and as I said, I gratefully received my tips. And then we'd meet them in the hotel later and just look at them and laugh. And I've seen some pretty embarrassed people. I'd come down to dinner, take a bath, and put my dress on and come down to dinner, and my day's employer would take a look at me and look twice, you know. And I always said pleasantly, "Good evening, sir." And they, "Whoa, dear." Dear me. Well, now about my family. I had a wonderful mother, and I had a wonderful father, but they were conservative. Mother was very, very conservative. Father worked terribly hard and made himself a lot of money. Was very fortunate. Mother came from a very, very good family, and she married a man who, as they say in those days, was a scoundrel. Just a plain old Victorian scoundrel. And Mother divorced him, which people didn't do in those days, and then that made her, because divorced women were heaven knows what they were liable to do next. But she had a marvelous pedigree. As we say in the horse business, she wrote a wonderful 64 ancestor pedigree. And Father wrote no pedigree at all, but had a nice fat bank account, and they made a great combination. Mother was very fond of Father, and Father adored Mother, and she had the pedigree, and he had the money, and they went from there. And they had a great time. One of the stories about them, which has nothing to do with Naples, but it is rather a story, and it illustrates the sort of people they were. When I was a little kid, I guess I was about 8 maybe, a circus came to town, Ringling Brothers. And in those days, circuses were really fun. They had a parade down the main street of the town they came to, which in our case was Newark. And then that night they had a performance there was a big baseball field. And they had the menagerie tent set outside the big tent. You came in early and went around and looked at all the animals, and then you rushed in and sat down and watched the show. Well, Father loved circuses, and he allowed us how he was going to take the family to the circus. Well, our hearts really sank when we heard this, because going anywhere with Father always ended up in some kind of disaster, because he knew all about what he was doing. He made all the plans and forgot half of the things that should be done. And you had to go from the best you could, because he was very firm. He'd say, I'll get the tickets, I'll do it all. Then he wouldn't get the tickets, or he'd forget them or something. So we always were a little worried about whether we were going to get there or not. But this night we had everything together. And we went down to Newark to go to the circus, and we were late. And we had to hurry and going past the big parade that was getting ready to go around the tent. And of course those big circus parades were led always by an enormous elephant. And perched atop the enormous elephant, with the legs crossed tastefully, was always a gorgeous blonde in a lame gold bodysuit and more white ostrich plumes than anybody ever saw in all the world. And she looked naked as a jaybird and covered with ostrich plumes. And of course, I thought she was wonderful. She rode on an elephant. That's what I would like to do. In fact, I made plans to be a woman that rode on the elephant. But I just adored this whole bit. I thought this woman had the greatest job in the world. And we were late, and Father had a friend who was a banker in Newark, named Uncle Ned Bright, and Uncle Ned handled the payroll for Ringling while they were there, and he had arranged for the seats and one thing and another, and had somebody to guide us in. So we were snuck in, we were late. And we went by the big #1 elephant. Father in the lead, and Jimmy right behind him, and me behind that, and Mother bringing up the rear, in a hurry. And as Father got level with the big elephant, this gorgeous lady on top of the elephant leaned over with her beautiful ostrich feathers waving in the air, and said with a dazzling smile, "Oh, good evening, Mr. Jones. So nice to see you again." Well, it produced instantaneous results. Instantaneous. They were different in nature. Father's face turned scarlet. He was barely able to manage to get his hand to his derby hat to lift it. He jerked Jenny by the arm to take her in so far that her legs flew off the ground and she shot through the air as he went in. I was filled with more admiration for Father than ever. I always thought he was wonderful, and now I knew the lady on the elephant. I mean, what more of a father could you have than the father that knew the lady on the elephant? So I was just transfixed with joy and admiration. Mother did not have the same reaction. I looked briefly at her, and a look of total disbelief passed over her face, followed by one of such icy disapproval that the whole tent dropped at least 20 degrees. Well, Father had an awful time trying to explain that to Mother. And we didn't have much conversation during the performance. I was on one end, where the kids were in the middle, and Mother and Father were here. Mother just sat through the performance looking straight ahead, and Father kept clearing his throat and saying, "Oh, I never saw that woman. Honest to God, Ellen. I never saw her